from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. This is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. I am here this week with Ralph Reed, the founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Ralph, thank you so much for being here. As mentioned, you are the founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. It's a nonprofit that has grown into quite the force. And by the way, I was around when you started it, but a force in part because you exist to mobilize people of faith to the ballot box. This year, I think you're spending more than $60 million in voter registration and education and turnout. You boast of an engagement of some 32 million evangelicals and Catholics. I want to jump right into the election. Your group is supporting Donald Trump as it did in 2020 and 2016. And we'll talk a bit more in a minute as to why. But let's talk first about the dynamics. This obviously is a different cycle, one that comes after Trump lost that election and the events of January 6th. We've had his convictions in a courtroom. We had a Republican primary where 40% of people in some states chose Nikki Haley. Clearly, voters who vote on the right as a whole have had a little bit of uneasiness, or at least they did in the primary season with Donald Trump this time around. What do you see out there in the evangelical community? Are they more motivated, less motivated? Are there concerns?
Well, if you go back and look at those primaries, he won the overwhelming percentage of the evangelical vote in those early primaries. Iowa being the most important, of course, South Carolina probably being the second most important. Self-identified evangelicals are about 60% of the vote in both of those states. So Trump's strong performance in those early caucuses and primaries isn't arithmetically possible without overperforming among those voters. And even though we remain neutral in the primary, as we did in 16, by the way, I made it clear to anyone who asked that I thought as a result of the policies and the priorities of the first Trump administration on issues like unborn life, religious freedom, court appointments, support for the state of Israel, that there would be a very deep reservoir of gratitude for him that would translate into tangible political support. And that did, in fact, happen. The Republicans, in contrast to the Democrats, had a real primary process, and he's now the nominee. I think that this general election, he's going to enjoy evangelical and social conservative support that is even stronger than he received in 2020, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, I'm really struck by that. When I talk to evangelical voters, what motivates them, what animates them? And of course, they care about all these things like the economy and inflation and crime and the border. But I'm really struck by the word you used, gratitude, to Donald Trump in particular. And here's the thing that always jumps out to me. It's one of the first things they say, issues that have to do with the Supreme Court. So not just overturning Roe and the Dodd decision, but new freedom of expression of faith in the public square, the Little Sisters of the Poor cases, and freedom from Obamacare's attempt to force Americans to act against their conscience. That Coach Kennedy case in Colorado, praying with his students at Midfield, the dismantling, just to get geeky here for a minute, of the lemon test. It seems like mainstream media and Democrats seem to miss this about what motivates some of these voters. What else are they missing in the evangelical community? What are the top of mind issues for some evangelical voters that might not be the things that the other average voter suddenly goes to the ballot box for?
First of all, you've done a great job there of kind of elucidating how the transformation of the federal courts under Donald Trump, including the Supreme Court, was so critical to Christians being able, in their mind and in his stated intent, to regain their voice in the conversation of democracy. You talked about the lemon test. Don't want to get too down in the weeds in Supreme Court jurisprudence, but this is a case, from the 1980s that basically, in its application, said that there couldn't be any law or government action that promoted religion or inhibited religion. It was a very complicated three-part test that in its application did things like outlawing a non-sectarian prayer at a graduation ceremony.
Right.
So having the court overturn that test and say that freedom of speech included speech of a religious content was an epical moment in the history of the First Amendment and the post-World War II period. You mentioned the Dobbs decision, but there's another thing that needs to be underscored here. For the first time since 1938, for the first time in the memory of almost anyone alive today, you have a Democratic nominee for president running, promising to eliminate the filibuster, and upon elimination of the filibuster, pass a law that would impose term limits on Supreme Court justices for the first time in American history. Those are 18-year term limits that would remove from the court 3 of the current conservative justices,
Yes.
Roberts, Alito, and Thomas, and create a liberal majority on the court. So this is a very radical move that nobody's tried since Franklin Roosevelt tried it in the 1930s. And believe you me, this will be on every one of our voter guides. It'll be on every one of our door hangers. It will come up in every conversation we have. And I'll mention one other issue really quickly, but it rivals the life issue and the abortion issue to these voters, and that is support for the State of Israel. Donald Trump kept his promise to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He did a whole lot more beyond that, including recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, including turning the screws on the Iranian regime through sanctions that was on the verge of making it financially impossible for Iran to continue to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and other military proxies on the level they had in the past. And for many of these voters, Kim, they look at the equivocation and the waffling and the false equivalency that has defined this administration's posture towards Israel, Iran, and its military proxies, and they see the right of the Jewish people to their own state in the Middle East in grave danger, and they will vote on that issue.
Let's talk about that a little, because obviously we just finished the Democratic convention. They put on a very good show, and you didn't hear a lot about any of that equivocation. But what they did do, and I thought they did it pretty well, was they were trying to showcase the claim that Kamala Harris is going to unite the country. And as part of that, we've seen all these coalitions pop up to claim to support her, and they range from white guys for Kamala to deadheads for Kamala. And yes, there is this new group now, Evangelicals for Harris. And I saw an op-ed in MSNBC this week by Doug Padgett of Vote Common Good, and he claimed, and I quote here, that this religious coalition has the ability to break MAGA's hold over evangelical voters. And he went on to say that many evangelicals feel Trump lacks kindness, given his personality and past actions, that he doesn't share their values, and he brought up his convictions. The left is also branding Kamala Harris as a woman of faith and playing up her running mate, Tim Walz's Lutheran identity. Some names in churches that have traditionally been on the left are stepping up to support them. How real, how large of a movement of evangelicals is this on her behalf?
You know, I think you never want to be overconfident, and I will certainly commend them for at least making an effort, which certainly Hillary Clinton, for example, really didn't in 2016 and paid dearly for it. So I guess they get maybe a C for effort, but in terms of the authenticity of what they're trying to do, it's really more of the same. It's style over substance. It's personality over policy. And what they're missing, and they're not alone, by the way, is that evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in spite of some of their reservations and feelings about him as a person because of where he stood on policy. And when you have Harris promising to pack the Supreme Court, promising to repeal the filibuster so that they can pass a federal bill that would codify Roe v. Wade into federal law for the first time, and would go way beyond Roe in allowing abortion at any stage of pregnancy if the mother's health is in danger. And that goes undefined. So it could be psychological, it could be emotional. It's really abortion at any stage of pregnancy for any reason. And she wants to create a new entitlement under the Medicaid program to pay for elective abortions for the first time since the Hyde Amendment became law under Jimmy Carter in 1978. When you combine that radical and extremist social agenda on life with a court packing scheme, with this false equivalency between Israel and the terrorists that want to wipe Israel off the map, they're going to have a very hard time making any progress in this community, because the problem is not identity politics, which is the card they're trying to play. Vote for us because we go to church and Donald Trump says and does things you don't like. They're missing the policy. We're going to make sure these voters are educated on policy and where she stands and where Tim Walz stands. And I think the last thing they want is for voters of faith to know where she stands on packing the court, on life, on Israel, and on Iran. And once we make that clear, I think that Donald Trump, I'm not in the prediction business, but he got 81% of this vote in 2016. He got 84% of this vote in 2020. That's the largest share of that vote ever recorded since exit polling began.
This is self-identified evangelicals? I'm just making sure. What is the voting group? Yeah.
Self-identified evangelicals. And I believe the number will be higher in 2024.
We're going to take a break. When I come back, more with Ralph Reed, founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel, and I'm here with Ralph Reed. Obviously, what you're describing here is a vast education effort. I know that you guys also stage Get Out the Vote operations. What does your ground game look like this year?
Well, it's the most expansive and ambitious, not only in our history, Kim, but in the history of the pro-family movement. We will knock on 10 million doors of self-identified evangelicals and modeled social conservatives in the battleground states. We'll reach between 17 and 18 million voters at the door, because the industry standard is you have somewhere between 1.6 and 2 registered voters in each of those households. They will get emails. They will get phone calls that are timed before and after the door knock. If they are a low propensity voter that has voted in one or fewer of the last 3 elections, they'll get at least 2 door knocks. We will send out 28 million Get Out the Votes text messages. We will put 30 million voter guides in 113,000 churches nationwide that detail where the candidates stand on all the key issues, not just the moral issues that we're talking about, but taxes, the economy, inflation, the border, etc. We want them to be educated on a wide range of issues because, as you correctly pointed out earlier, they vote on those issues. They're not all single issue voters. They care about the economy. They care about the border. So it's a total of 221 million voter contacts.
Goodness.
Focused on about 30 million voters in those battleground states. And if we do what our after action analysis in prior elections, both primary and general, have indicated, the full mix of these multiple touches, and it will be 8 to 12 touches to each household or voter, we believe we can lift their turnout at a minimum of 5%. And perhaps as much as 10%. And when we do that, it will be more than the margin needed in every one of these battleground states.
Yeah, that was a question I had. When you say 5% to 10%, how many voters are you talking about there?
Some of that is proprietary. I'm not necessarily published my playbook.
See, I'm asking the right questions, right?
Yes, you are. But I'm not going to give out what our databases are in individual battleground states. But suffice it to say that when you're talking about an election, Kim, that we believe will be decided by 5, 10, 20, 30,000 votes in 3 to 5 states, just the lift in turnout among these voters alone will be more than the margin separating Biden and Trump in most of these battleground states 4 years ago.
Is it giving anything away to just say, obviously, all the battlegrounds matter, right? But Are there some where the evangelical vote is going to matter more, or where there's simply more of them and it could be more decisive in a victory?
Well, I certainly think that's the case in Georgia. It has one of the highest shares of an evangelical vote of any battleground. It's likely to be somewhere between 34 and 35%, the entire electorate. And by the way, when Brian Kemp was last on the ballot, which was in 2022, he won 91% of that vote. So if something like that were to happen again, it would clearly tip the state as it did for him in 22. I would say behind that, probably Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, Kim, it wouldn't just be the self-identified evangelicals. It would be what I refer to as the Bob Casey Catholics.
Yep.
Pro-life, faithful, frequently mass attending. That is right at about 1.5 million to 1,700,000 votes, those two groups together in Pennsylvania. And if they turn out in the numbers they're capable of, and our program is going to ensure that they do, I think that will be probably second only to Georgia in terms of the seismic role that evangelicals are going to play. I'll mention one last thing about this program that you won't usually see reported, and that is that 20% of the doors that we knock on and the homes that we visit will be minority households. And one of the big stories in 2024, I believe, is going to be the shift among minority voters of faith, and especially among Hispanics. Even after this surge that Harris has enjoyed since Biden stepped aside, and there's no question that the enthusiasm gap has narrowed, that the polling has narrowed. This is now a jump ball. But even with that, in most of the national polling, Donald Trump is either leading among Hispanic voters or it's within the margin of error. And that could have huge consequences in November. It's one of the reasons why I think he may win Nevada. It's one of the reasons why New Mexico's in play. And there are many other states with a huge number of Hispanic voters, including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, where they're going to be a factor.
That's a really interesting question, because some analysts, and I would put myself in this category, when we have seen some of those numbers about minority voters increasingly voting for Donald Trump. Now we're talking about not the majority in most cases. You were laying out a potentially different scenario, at least when it comes to Hispanics this year. But certainly we've seen a shift over the years. And some of us have suggested that this has to do with working class issues, that these are working class voters, and we put it under that umbrella of class being an issue in how you vote and those issues that matter to you, and that as a Republican Party has looked more like the working class party, that is what is attracting those voters. You're suggesting that a sizable portion of those minority voters are being driven as well by faith issues?
By faith issues, and also by community-specific issues, such as what's going on in Venezuela. I mean, remember, there's between 300,000 and 400,000 Venezuelans in Florida alone, and they still have a lot of ties to those countries. And when they see the way the Trump-Pence administration stood up to tyrants and authoritarians in that region, secured the border, took tough stands on protecting the homeland, these resonate in these communities. So I think, Biden essentially taking a much softer approach to Venezuela and other countries, including oil from Venezuela, this has resonated everywhere. And for a lot of Hispanic voters who either entered the country legally or got legal, they did the hard work of getting a green card and seeking to become a citizen. They do not appreciate an open southern border that allows 10 million or more people to enter the country illegally, including many who pose a danger and a threat to them and their families. And this thing has completely backfired in the Hispanic community for all the reasons that I've indicated. And it's somewhat counterintuitive, because Trump was someone who came on the national scene from that very opening news conference when he announced his candidacy, taking a tough stand on the border. The conventional wisdom was that that would drive Hispanic voters away, and it's really done the opposite.
We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with Ralph Reed, founder and chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel. You're here with All Things with Kim Strassel, and we're talking with Ralph Reed. Obviously, we've had a lot of talk about this. Abortion is going to be on the ballot in some of these key states, initiatives that would essentially offer pro-choice initiatives on the ballot, in particular, Arizona, Nevada, Florida. What we have seen in the last election cycle is that this drives turnout on the left. And to be honest, it has driven turnout to the left in a way that hasn't been great for the conservative side. How does that play in terms of your voters and getting them out? Does it motivate people on the right? And if it does, why isn't it motivating them more, given some of the results we've seen?
I think what I'm concerned about is it kind of recalls that old Time magazine cover, I believe, from the, I guess it was at that time, the 30th anniversary of Roe, where Time had the cover that said, "Feminists won a major victory with Roe v. Wade." And then the subheadline was, "And they've been losing ever since." And sometimes when you win an historic Supreme Court victory, like they did with Roe in 1973 and like we did with Dobbs in 2022, the energy, the activism shifts to the other side as a backlash against that court victory. And I think that's what we've experienced. The other thing that a lot of people aren't really noticing or commenting on is that the life issue was never a good issue in an initiative and referendum environment. Even in California under Arnold Schwarzenegger, parental notification, simply notifying a parent that a minor child was going to have an abortion, just as they would have to be notified about any other surgical procedure. It tested in the polls at over 80%, but lost at the ballot box.
Why?
Well, because doing a poll doesn't really replicate what happens in an actual campaign environment where you're going to get outspent 3, 4, or 5 to 1 by Planned Parenthood or others. So it's a little bit like the school choice issue or education reform issue, where I can go out and do a poll in a state and I can show you that a clear majority, not only of all voters, but of minority voters, want school choice. But if I put it on the ballot and the teachers union does an assessment of its members and drops $40 million in TV ads, you lose, you see? So we're better at approaching this issue legislatively. They're better at the initiative and referendum. And that's why we've lost these. But here's what they're missing. They're also turning out Trump voters, obviously not pro-life evangelical Trump voters, but they're turning out Trump voters who are going to vote for their initiative and then vote for Donald Trump.
Okay, Ralph, last question. You wrote a pretty powerful op-ed for us recently talking about this new tactic on the left and among the media to discuss anyone who has faith as a Christian nationalist. I'm not even going to give any credibility to this kind of nonsense talk. I mean, as if reading a Bible and going to church and praying makes somebody radical. It's actually the history of this country, the definition of the majority of Americans. But we're seeing this labeling happening a lot to people who are free market, people of faith. They're MAGA ultra Republicans or far right nationalists. My question is, why do you think they are doing this, and what impact do you think it has?
If you believe, as I do, that they're aware of the math that we've walked through during this podcast, that you're looking at somewhere between a quarter to a third of the vote nationally and in these battleground states. I mean, remember, Kim, if you take the self-identified evangelicals, they're about 27% of the electorate. If you add the frequently mass-attending pro-life faithful Catholics, it's about another 11%. So you're looking at total about 38% of all voters, and you're losing those voters 80 to 85%. this becomes a math issue in these battlegrounds. It's a serious problem for them. Now, the challenge is that they seem to think that the way to persuade these voters to vote for them is to insult them and to claim that they're a threat to democracy and that they may even be prone to authoritarianism and violence, and to say that people who work Monday through Friday, coach Little League on Saturday, and go to church or mass on Sunday are what ails American democracy. That not only is not true, it is not only on the face of it absurd, but it is in the same category as Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. It's a way of taking something that is a positive social good. Even if you don't agree with my faith, it is a fact of social science that faith leads to stronger marriages, stronger families, stronger and safer communities, and it takes that and tries to make it something ugly and anti-democratic and dangerous. And these voters will be insulted by it. I think the objective, I'm speculating, of course, but I think the objective is to sort of label these people as the other, to kind of label them as dangerous, scare secular voters, thereby increasing their turnout, and potentially suppressing the votes of evangelicals who may have issues with Donald Trump. So I think that's what they're trying to do. I don't think it will work. I actually think it will backfire, as did the basket of deplorables.
Well, we certainly live in interesting times. I think we're both lucky to actually be taking part in all of this. Ralph Reed, thank you so much for sharing all of your insight, and look forward to keeping in touch with you as this election goes forward.
Thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you to all of our listeners. We are here every week. If you like this podcast, please hit your subscribe button. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com, and we hope to have you here next week.